welcome everyone. Very excited to have Nadia Bou Ali with us to talk about her book, Psychoanalysis and the Love of Arabic, which I just had the pleasure of finishing. Welcome to the program, Nadia. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks, Daniel, for this invitation and for kind of spending time with the book and wanting to have a conversation about it.
Yeah. No, it's been a long interest of mine to look at these issues of culture, of psychoanalysis, of kind of like the rich insights that Lacan gives to us, and sort of to work through these dynamics. Obviously, there has been since 9/11 this notion of clash of civilizations, and so many psychoanalytic commentators in the Western countries and in Muslim majority societies or Arab societies have turned to psychoanalysis. And there's a lot of even like sociological literature which shows that psychoanalysis in Muslim societies, Arab societies, has a vibrant presence in, like, for example, in Iran. I don't know about vibrant, but it definitely is amongst the bourgeois classes, maybe even more available in some places than in the West. So psychoanalysis is already somewhat kind of rooted in those cultures. Although that's not really what your book is about. Your book is a historical analysis of the birth of Arab liberalism and the birth of Arab modernity, with a particular focus on sort of two very interesting literary figures, which we're going to talk about. So this is a work of comparative literature. It is unabashedly Lacanian. You're primarily working with Lacan's concepts and ideas, and you do so very well, I must say. I wanted to begin by looking at, obviously we know in Lacan's very commented upon seminar on the Purloined Letter, this whole Edgar Allan Poe logic of the signifier, which he then revisits by about seminar 17, seminar 18 and onward. There is then a return to the question of literature. And towards the beginning of the book, you offer, I think, an exceptionally coherent statement as to why, or sort of, here's what Lacan offers to thinking about literature as a concept. So I wanted to begin by that and sort of ask you, why is Lacan's treatment of literature compelling for you?
Okay, yeah, great question there. I mean, it's so there's, you know, Lacan's relationship to literature. I mean, not only Lacan, I mean, psychoanalysis, you know, as a field, from Freud, you know, to Lacan, to other kind of psychoanalytic thinkers, they always feel free to dip into literature somewhat to elucidate questions or problems or issues within the psychoanalytic field, right? So literature has always been, how do you say, kind of a fortuitous companion for psychoanalysis in a certain way. And I think what I wanted to, so I mean, this engagement with Lacan and literature, I suppose, in the book, kind of, you know, why I wanted to do that, because, you know, it might seem at the beginning like an unnecessary long theoretical kind of interlude into something before I actually kind of, you know, engage with the texts that I'm looking at or the authors I'm thinking about. And on the one hand, there's this kind of, you know, perhaps not so explicitly stated aim of insisting on the importance of psychoanalytic engagement of literature within a field, right, which is kind of Arabic, Middle Eastern studies, that is generally, in a certain sense, how would you say, kind of the dominant mode of analysis of literature in that field is somewhat of a different strain, right? Deconstructionist, or mostly so, kind of deconstructionist approaches, or approaches that you can say are grounded in kind of a deconstructionist account of literature, which seem to, in many ways, lend themselves to a lot of, how would one kind of put it, kind of post-colonial accounts of kind of literary cultural production in non-European parts of the world. And so I took it as a chance to first situate kind of the importance of why we would need something like psychoanalysis to deal with literary texts, or with literary texts that are somewhat not in the, how would you say, kind of canonical Western European what is considered to be literary or not, or so on and so forth, right? So it was necessary there to kind of point in this regard to why what Lacan has to offer, in particular, in thinking about literature. And the whole thing really hinges on the relationship between literature in a certain sense and culture, right? In a certain sense, is literature as a moment, here to sound a bit perhaps kind of Hegelian, as a kind of a moment of actualization of culture, but as a place where Lacan somewhat would add to that. So it's not simply that you have literature as a reflection, right? A superstructure, kind of a whatever, how do you say, kind of in a classical Marxian formalist account, like it's simply kind of represents a historical moment, or kind of somehow gives you an account of an epoch, or is a mirror, right, of a particular moment, of a zeitgeist, or so on and so forth. But I think there's something more intriguing in Lacan's kind of approach to literature, the way he places it in relationship to, in relationship to his understanding of the symbolic, of the sphere of the symbolic, or the field of the symbolic. And so Lacan, he picks up on literature in so many places in his seminars. One could almost write a history of Lacanian seminars through his literary invocations, right? You could do this, right? And of course, it's in the late Lacan where he, engages with figures like Joyce, and things get really messy, right? And almost incomprehensible. He has a number of texts which are infamously, notorious for their kind of incoherence, or kind of, it's very hard to grasp what Lacan's doing there, because he's dealing with literature at the later stage in relationship to something like formalization and kind of science, right? And in relationship to his account of what he sees to be kind of the function of writing in relationship to the symbolic and the real, so the written word, right? And I think here, just as a kind of a side note, in the late Lacan works, Lacan makes this distinction between signification, or the signifier, and written language, formalization. And he's particularly interested in the matheme, and there's a lot of recent scholarship on this kind of the late Lacan's and his work on formalization. And so he posits this relationship between signification and the letter qua signifier, right? The written qua signification. So he makes a kind of a separation, which I find so intriguing, between symbolic sphere, i.e. kind of a sphere of kind of, the work of signifiers, the chain of signification from S1 to S2 to so on. And on another somewhat level, the written fact, the literal kind of leftover thing, the object, the Joycean text, right? The work of language that appears to have absolutely no utility, no value, right? This kind of that literature as that, right? And so Lacan posits this kind of, or makes this kind of distinction between, or proposes that there's one could take literature and not simply read it as a moment of, how do you say, reflection or actualization of culture, but as a place wherein you have what he calls kind of these moments of puncturing holes into the symbolic, right? This is why I borrow from Lacan, I think the title for the chapter, or somewhere he says it in perhaps not the exact words, but literature as a kind of a ruthless excavator of culture. I think Daniel Nobis actually might also kind of have discussed this in some work that he's had on literature. But so the idea is to read literature against, do you know what I mean, zeitgeist, against kind of spirit, or literature as a moment that, how do you say, kind of gives us or breaks open the consistency of forms, right? Yeah. Although we need an account of form. However, what form is that? I ground my whole book in the social forms of modern capitalist society. We can't understand any of the 19th century, 20th century moment without saying that, we begin there. We are in already kind of a capitalist sphere, right, of real abstraction, right? So there are particular social forms that, one has in mind there, but take commodity forms, so on and so forth. But literature is somewhat kind of a place to kind of read, to read a moment against itself, right? To kind of see the work of the symbolic failing to symbolize, culture failing to somewhat become a totality, to be a kind of a whole, right? It's kind of like a sense in the failures to identify with Arabic, you find the moment of, how do you say, you find this somehow is coincidental to the moment of saying, oh, this is what the Arab is, this is what the Arabs are, this is what the Arabic language is, right? So I find it very intriguing that, so I take Lacan, I take the cue from Lacan to enter into this discussion of how can it be that the Arabic language, right, is rediscovered in the modern moment as the reflection, right, as the mirror of the self, of the nation, call it what you want, the community, the group, the collective. And the moment that it is rediscovered as that, it appears as such an uncanny sphere, a place of signification that is how do you say, at least with one of the authors I work on, Shidyaq, is a place of kind of slippages, homonyms, metonymy, displacement, right? Of kind of, an attempt to interpret the fantasy within which the symbolic is folded, and perhaps, a place where you rehearse the failures to do that interpretation. So this is kind of, in a sense, why I insisted on, or kind of why I insist in the book, that we need the psychoanalytic account of literature as this kind of, what bores a hole in the symbolic, what breaks, in a certain sense, literature as a place that breaks the signifying chain, but somewhat also, shows how it is at work, right? It exposes the way it is at work, right?
I really appreciate that, and that overview of your argument. That was excellent. I really also like you remind us that Lacan wished to give a philosophical claim against Plato and Plato's theory of reminiscence in his reading of Edgar Allan Poe in particular, but other literary figures as well, because the signifier and the repetition of it has a prior form. So that, could you say something briefly about that? That's very interesting to me. I think this is something that Lacan kind of later formalizes. And of course, there's a large philosophical debate as to whether Lacan can be read more in line with Aristotle or Plato. I know Aaron Schuster and others have broached this question. What do you make of this sort of argument against Platonic memory, right? Ultimately, in Lacan's proposal that actually the logic of the signifier is more central. So could you help us maybe just slightly elaborate on that? I loved that point that you made there.
Well, I guess what Lacan, this is a long discussion, of course. And there are others who have commented on this extensively. There's Schuster, there's Mladen Dollar, that he has a really good piece on repetition, or kind of which repetition are we talking about in Lacan, which, works its way through Aristotle, not so much Plato, right? This in the analysis. But I think what would be important is that, to say, or to kind of, the distinction here would be that, that Lacan does posit, in a certain sense, repetition against reminiscence, right? Or repetition versus reminiscence. And he uses, the figure of Kierkegaard and introduces the concept of repetition as a fundamental concept in psychoanalysis, right? As one of the crucial, to say, kind of we cannot think the drive without repetition. We cannot think the symptom without repetition. We cannot think the symbolic without repetition, and the failures in repetition, right? But I think the crucial point is, at least in what I try to do with the book, is I try to distinguish what Lacan does there in contradistinction to, let's say, kind of a more kind of deconstructionist model, where you have, of course, an argument about the trace, right? The trace is as a kind of a place of radical alterity, like a la Derrida or Paul de Man or so on and so forth. But with Lacan, it's yes, there's something in the repetition of the signifier that has the element of, of course, alterity, of otherness that is introduced into kind of every how do you say, moment, or every kind of a moment of the repetition of the dialectic of identification, right? The signifier representing itself for another signifier. However, there's an important distinction here, because it's a repetition of something that, in a certain sense, was not there before, right? Perhaps here, in relationship to reminiscences, or kind of the way that one can think about that account of memory, is that the repetition function in Lacan, right, is implicitly based on the repetition of something that failed to appear in the first place, right? The S1, the master signifier, signification takes place or begins in the place of a signifier gone missing, right? I think this is a way to kind of to kind of put it. So this is a different, it's an account of negativity rather than some kind of ontological fullness or a totality, right? That you begin from the absence, from the missing thing, but there was nothing there to begin with, and then somehow, I argue that somehow, Lacan, in Joyce's language, the function of the homonym, the repetition of his phonemic, right? This kind of what Lacan calls kind of Joyce's linguistic diarrhea, right? His linguisteria, which I see as being there somewhat in a figure like Shidyaq. And I think so many moments in the text, it's really, you cannot miss it. I mean, it's so evidently there, right? That how do you, and simply memory that would lend itself to philology, right? To tracing, to the meaning of words philologically, etymologically, giving them a deep history, right? All this kind of work that is done already on language, but
yeah,
that psychoanalysis makes possible a different approach, right?
Yes.
Where you have an account of form, but it's an account of form that also has a place for the work of the negative in literature, for negativity's representation in literature, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a bit maybe.
Yeah. No, it's really nice. It's a really nice thing. I mean, I know in Lacan's notoriously difficult essay, Littérature, he makes this wonderful claim about the relationship between literature and a civilization's management of feces, of shit.
Yes, it's waste, exactly. No, it's trash. Yes.
Yeah. So this book of yours is also, while it is a literary critique, and I want to return to that, it is also very much a substantial and interesting critique of liberalism. Of course, modern capitalism is a kind of necessary correlate or partner in liberalism. However, you do focus quite a lot on liberalism, and in particular, if I could say, your argument is that the subject of the political subject in modern Arab liberalism and in modern Arab thought as such has gone missing, and that there is a void there, or a lack of thought. And I want to invite you to explain why that might be, and ask you why that might be the case. You are very much opposed, which we will talk about in a moment as well, to this notion of culturalism, and what we already saw the intimation as to why you are suspect of that, because of the wholeness that it confers onto an identity, or onto the genus of a nation, and some kind of theory of their harmonious existence, right? This is problematized by psychoanalysis, right? And of course, the failure of liberals to identify a political subject is not just Arab intellectuals. This is a global issue. So what's going on here with this notion of the subject of politics, particularly in the Arab context?
Yeah, this is, probably how do you say, the $1 million, no, $1 million is not much anymore. I don't know what doggy coin, million doggy coin question. And in the 20th century, right? Where is the subject of politics? How has it gone missing? How can we, excavate? How we locate it? What do we name it? We have so many paths to go on, right? But of course, one point in general is that, again, the insistence on psychoanalysis, at the risk of sounding like a fundamentalist psychoanalytic kind of theorist, is that, Lacan was the the only kind of figure in this kind of the moment of post-structuralism, or the moment of the turn, right, the postmodern kind of literary turn, so on and so forth, where, you know, he insisted on maintaining the category of the subject, right? This is very important, in contradistinction to Foucault or even Althusser, right? The death of man, the death of the subject, all this, you know, was happening at the time, where somehow Lacan is maintaining the importance, or the crucial importance of the category of the subject of the unconscious, right? So is the subject of politics the subject of the unconscious? This is kind of, you know, probably already complex, you know, making the answer to the question much more complex, because how do you locate the subject of the unconscious to begin with? You know, if the unconscious is a site of political antagonism, of politics, of contradiction, of whatever, agonism, of all this stuff, right? How do you locate the subject of the unconscious beyond the kind of, you know, so beyond the framework that Lacan provides of, or kind of, or Lacan's answer to that, or I think the way that, you know, I try to employ that is that he insists that you know, the subject is, you know, as Lacan says, is kind of the response to the real, right? The subject is that which is not foldable simply under the imaginary identifications of the ego, of egoic functions, of the liberal I, the self-transparent subject, the self-positing subject, right? These kind of categories of subject, the subject of intersubjective communication, right? This subject, and also not the subject that is somewhat identified by cultural norms, if you want, by the values of culture, right? By the role, the whatever, the familial setup, the whatever, the subject that is named by the subject supposed to know. So neither of these two, right? So the subject of politics is not the subject of the imaginary, nor the subject of the symbolic, but a sign, right? A subject of the real. How do you do this? How to construct, you know, how do you really kind of name the determinations of this subjectivity? What is it, right? If it's not just kind of the negative obverse, right? The cut, you know, as Slavoj Žižek or others have, you know, the kind of the break, the cut, the how do you say, the opens up, the subject is exactly the crack, the place of the real, where the real happens, right? What cannot be represented. And I think, but this leaves us, you know, I mean, I think the way the book heads in the direction is that, you know, then the subject of politics, I mean, if I can say that one can locate the emergence of that in a moment in, let's say, Shidyaq's kind of meanderings about sex and am I a man, am I a woman, can I procreate, can I inherit, what language do I speak, who is my father, what is my name, right? This kind of Shidyaq's kind of word plays and his kind of the descriptions of this, the plights of the subject that is the sexed subject, the subject of the sexual non-relation, the subject of the body, right? The subject that has a body, right? Of the subject of the drive, right? These would be the moments, I suppose, that I think are crucial to locate that kind of subject, or that kind of subject.
Yes, and I know you have mentioned Shidyaq, this very enigmatic and very fascinating Arab writer. He wrote a book which you translate as Leg Over Leg, and I tried to do some research on Ahmad Faris Shidyaq, and I found a little, but it seems like, I don't know, there's not much translated into English.
Well, actually, he has been. I mean, recently the translator has, unfortunately, I think he's recently died. He did an unbelievable work, kind of Humphrey Davis, who's a translator of kind of Arabic literature. I mean, I think it's I started working on Shidyaq before that translation came out. So in some places in the text, it's my translations, but then I think in many places I adopt Humphrey Davis's translations because, you know, he brilliantly captures the movements of Shidyaq's kind of language. And it's pretty nice that actually the volumes are all out in English now. They're available.
Wow.
Yeah, there are 4 volumes of the entire book, right? That was kind of, one would say is unreadable in Arabic. As I say, it's kind of a bit like a Joycean text because there's so much kind of enjoyment of the author that there's no way for you to partake in the author's enjoyment at all, right?
And it has Joycean resonance, but it also seems to have Pessoa resonance insofar as there's all kinds of alternative personae that the author invents. So can you just give us the snapshot of why this figure is so interesting and so significant for you, but also maybe for Arabic literature as such?
Yeah, I want to do that, but I want to just add one more point, if I can, to the question about the subject of politics, and also kind of, why do this in the Arabic, why look at this in the Arabic context, or and I think there's also one important, so it's not just the kind of the culturalist, argument. There's also, there's so much interesting work in theoretical psychoanalysis and work on literature and psychoanalysis. And I think I also found, I love Eric Santner's work, right? I think his work is brilliant, and there's so much to work with what he has kind of put forth, right? But I think there's an argument that Santner makes, and I think it's in the text on the book on Rosenzweig, and kind of he makes a particular kind of account about, in a certain sense, that there's how do you say, kind of we would not have had somewhat psychoanalysis if there wasn't kind of if there wasn't, if in a certain sense Freud wasn't a Jew, right? It wasn't already excluded, right? Wasn't already occupying this position of alterity that made it possible for him to think alterity, or think the unconscious as alterity, or so on and so forth. And I think this is as much as it's it's a compelling argument, I think the book also, my argument is that do we really need to do that? Do we need to really maintain an exclusivity of the genealogy of psychoanalysis to that kind of Judaic kind of tradition, or kind of Christian Judaic tradition? Because you're in this context, right, where it is not that, it is not the discourse, right? It is not the how it defines the social link, right? And that's, anyways, you never map out this theory of discourses on this kind of categorization anyway in Lacan, right? So, and then you have 1860s, 1850s, right? An author of the Ottoman, subject of the Ottoman Empire, speaks Arabic from the Lebanese mountains, goes to Paris, to Malta, is in exile, is a kind of a, how do you say, kind of a refuse of the master's discourse, coming into the university discourse, trying to, figure like Shidyaq was such a learned man that, he was in Oxford and Cambridge for a while. He helped translate the Bible into Arabic. He tried to get a job. He wrote to the Queen Elizabeth saying, I'm, this great scholar from the Middle East, give me a job at Cambridge, give me a job at Oxford. Of course, ignored by all these kind of, philologists and kind of Orientalist kind of, people who worked within that field in Cambridge and Oxford. But he was a huge figure, right, in the sense of, between him and Bustani, the other author I look at, you find almost all the kind of formative foundational texts of the modern Arabic language, like the lexical, lexicographic, encyclopedic on Bustani's part, and literary, right? So there's this huge project which, is like a Bildung project, right? It requires a state, or like it's something that happened in Europe for over the course of, like, I don't know, so much time and funding and, patronages and whatever, right? Relations of, and so he's kind of, how would you say, kind of the founding, father, who I argue is a hysteric woman, really, founding father of Arabic, of modern Arabic and modern Arabic literature. He's, how do you say, a giant, right? Incomparable. There was even, and also very, how do you say, a very, very intriguing figure, because also not easily placed, right? He converted to Islam. He was born into a Catholic Maronite family. His brother was the first Protestant convert in the Middle East, who ended up, in a certain sense, slowly tortured by the Maronite Church and died because of his conversion to Protestantism. Inter-Christian problems there. He became a Muslim, but he was, I think, maintained, if you see from his works, clearly, the issue of belief is just what, what he works through in many ways in his writing, right? What am I inheriting? Who am I? So on and so forth. And, that even when he dies, right, there was a problem about where to bury his body. Like, they couldn't figure out what grave is this man to be put in, right? And his works, is it a Muslim grave? Is it a Christian grave? Is it, what kind of grave would you put this guy in, right? There was this kind of a problem about even, how do you say, signing off. So signing on, he takes on another name, right? He makes this name for himself. He calls himself as Shidyaq, or sometimes
Right.
the feminine of that. And then in his death also, it wasn't very clear who will inherit this. Who inherits a figure like this, right? So he creates a break. He creates a problem. It's a very intriguing kind of a question. Opens up a question of inheritance and disinheritance, right? Again, what works in the symbolic? Who am I? Who gives me my name? Who recognizes me? How am I all but a bundle and jumble of misrecognitions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so he's a very intriguing figure. I mean, there's more and more work done on Shidyaq in the recent years within the field of Middle East studies, I suppose. But I mean, I provide a very particular reading of him, right? As this kind of, how do you say, kind of a precursor to Joyce, a kind of a crazy mix of Joyce and Schreber as well.
And wow, and that's incredible. And then, of course, the second major figure is Bustani, who is really the architect, in many ways, intellectually speaking, of a particular form of Arab political theology that would become the kind of hegemonic form of Arab liberal thought in a certain sense. And number one. Number two, he also is somebody who systematizes and codifies an Arabic encyclopedia. And of course, Lacan's whole notion of the university discourse is like so present there and so fascinating as a way to understand his project. So could you tell us about Bustani and a little overlay of Bustani, please?
Yeah, I mean, Bustani is also, I mean, again, he's a fundamental kind of a formative figure of this kind of the Arab Enlightenment, right? The Arab Nahda, this kind of, a crucial moment culturally in, the Arabic speaking world of generally a liberal moment. Okay, I mean, a liberal, as I say, kind of liberal plus culturalist moment. I mean, here we can have this discussion later, because I mean, the Islamist kind of moment, the moment of the turn to Islam, is also part and parcel of this kind of grander, kind of liberal moment. I mean, there's, in a certain sense, I don't know how do we separate the two, despite all the, of course, insistence by many that they must be separated, that they're not the same thing, right? So Bustani, I mean, again, yes, of course, completely, in the university discourse, establishes the Beirut, the university I teach in, right? What was a kind of a Protestant missionary institute, which is today American University of Beirut, right? Creates pedagogical material, is one of also the first responders or respondents to a kind of a moment of, a formative moment of civil war in the region, right? The first moment of civil war in the region. He's, he's the amount of pedagogic and kind of lexical material he's produced, encyclopedias, all this work. I mean, again, massive enterprise, right? That this one man kind of somehow, partakes in. And I think the argument I tried to make in the book is that, he provides, or he's in a certain sense, how do you say, kind of one of the first incarnations of a kind of a bourgeois kind of consciousness, right? And its antinomies and its contradictions, right? And its problematics. He wants to, how do you say, kind of write a history of Arab culture. He wants to make an account for what habit is, what tradition is, what language can we use, what language we cannot, what is of utility, what is of not, right? He has this kind of, as I say, he also translates Robinson Crusoe, right? And he really writes the history of civilization, or the place of the Arabs in civilization, very much through this kind of Robinsonade, right? This kind of Robinsonade tale, right? The analogy of Crusoe, right? And I work through that a lot, in the book. And I mean, the argument is that in somewhat, Crusoe has such an interesting, as a figure, and in relationship to kind of Bustani's account of society, of social struggle, of, there's a peasant uprising unfolding in the Lebanese mountains and in Syria, and a quasi kind of anti-feudal. There's some communes established. I mean, I think even Marx comments on these events in the Lebanese mountains. Of course, Marx, he's misinformed at the beginning before someone corrects him later. He says it's like some kind of tribal warfare. Right? Of course, people love to pick on this, but Marx later on has a revisiting of that moment and kind of reads through it in a different way. But I mean, and Bustani in that particular moment, right, he writes this kind of, what I say is a kind of, he provides this kind of, I borrow from Santner, the psychotheological, right? But he develops it, of course, a la Protestantism, right? In a Protestant, the proper ethos of capital, right? Now that you have, society has broken apart, now that you have killed each other, you have fraternal enmity, fratricide, sectarianism, violence, this kind of, the neighbor killing the neighbor, this proper neighborly love. Now that you've actually had this, you must return to labor, right? You must go back to exchange. You must go back to industriousness. You must work, right? You must renunciate and only hope for the mercy of God to pay off your debts. So this whole kind of, I mean, and I spent quite some time on this, and I mean, and really, I mean, it's the material lends itself so much to already this. I mean, it's already explicitly almost making that kind of, it's kind of like it's almost kind of providing that analysis for itself. Really, when you look at the material. So
no, I mean, that's actually one of the beautiful things about your discussion of Bustani, which is it felt very contemporary. I don't know if that's the right word, but it felt very present in the sense that through the Lacanian lens that you're critiquing him, one can see the kind of basis of a certain theory of liberal subjection. I wouldn't say, of subjectivity, but also of subjection, of a certain relation of power, which I want to actually talk about with you, because one of the most influential interventions into this wider debate between kind of Islam and the West, or kind of that emerged in the early 2000s, just as the quote unquote war on terror was accelerating, was Wendy Brown's book, Regulating Aversion, Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire. In your work, you offer a kind of corrective of Brown. You offer a kind of, maybe we could say, comradely critique, which I would characterize and invite you to comment that you're pointing out things about her intervention that I think a lot of Marxist Lacanians, even Zizek, because he loved that book, if you remember, he not plagiarized, but he would repeat her themes everywhere, right? But he missed certain axiomatic commitments that she had in her analysis. And I want to invite you to describe sort of what, I guess you could say maybe why her text is not really a Lacanian text. I know that she doesn't presuppose to be Lacanian, but maybe we could say why any Lacanian that is serious really needs to look at what she's putting forward in a more critical lens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for, I mean, and it's kind of like this text. I mean, I think of course, I mean, I also, I mean, Wendy Brown's work is very important, right? And so far as, I mean, as a kind of a very, how do you say, kind of a self-conscious critique of the limits, right? Of kind of liberalism and the places where it kind of breaks down, right? It's kind of breaking points. And, I mean, I find her work on, the wounded attachments argument, I find that to be, very much Lacanian. I mean, it's very intriguing, and very important discussion. That's why the way she deals with Freud in this, text that I think was published in it was in this kind of political theologies compendium edited by Hent de Vries and some others. I'm not sure now if that's the correct. I think that's the volume where, I mean, the piece where I kind of focus a lot on, because she gives this kind of reading of Freud, which is very perplexing. Like she reads Freud precisely in a certain sense in the way you wouldn't want to read Freud, to make Freud helpful for our critique of liberal tolerance. I mean, it's kind of, it's a disfavor to her own position in a certain sense, if she wanted to kind of push that critique further, right? And I mean, the way she kind of engages with this, with kind of Freud's relationship. I mean, she basically reads Freud in many ways as kind of promulgating this kind of the same problem of kind of liberal individualism. I think she calls it. She argues that Freud kind of posits this kind of ontological I can't recall now the exact, let me try to find it, just, you know, let me just do,
you say the target of Brown's critique is the ego as the figure whose ontogeny captures phylogeny, which is very interesting. The figure assumed by a discourse of tolerance is premised on the distinction between those who are had by culture and those who have it. Maybe that's what you wanted to, that's page like 50.
Yes, I mean, yes, exactly. So yes, I'm in this section here. I mean, so yes, I mean, so she, you know, she makes this argument that, I mean, she reads Freud precisely in the way that you know, that Freud's argument about the formation of the ego and group psychology, right? I mean, she reads Freud in a sense in exactly the opposite way to what Freud kind of is doing in that text, right? Because Freud, otherwise, she reads Freud as a kind of how you would read Le Bon, or kind of group psychologists, right? Who want to argue that, you know, group formations, cultural formation, the symbolic, right, is a kind of an atavistic, kind of a return to a primordial horde, to the primitive kind of an infantile state, right? And they do this precisely to make an argument for the modern individual. So for group psychologists that Freud is arguing against in this text, group psychology is a problem. It has to be monitored and, how do you say, kind of organized and kind of, how do you say, forcefully sometimes eliminated by state formations, by control mechanisms, because it is this kind of counter-modern atavistic return to the primal horde, to primitive kind of identifications, right? So it's against the individual, right? For them to make this argument, they have to already assume the separation between individual and collective and community and culture. And Freud begins that very text, right, by saying that, you know, there is no way to sustain that separation. There's no way to sustain the separation between the individual ego and the collective. In fact, what Freud proceeds to do in the text on group psychology is to discern, right, the structure and the logic from within which the so-called dichotomy or binary of individual and community emerges, right, being the unconscious mechanisms, right, the part and parcel of the same, so that the I and the other, right, in a certain sense, are how do you say, retro, or kind of they have to be posited, or they kind of are mediated by the same logic, by the same structure, which is that of the unconscious. We can't understand the group without having an account of the ego as kind of the place, you know, within which all these images of love objects and so on and so forth kind of come to reside, right? The ego is nothing but, for Freud in that text, the measuring of the distance between the introjected love object, right, the ego ideal, and the kind of, you know, projected ideal ego, right? The ego is nothing but that distance, really. It's nothing but that kind of wavering in between, right? And famously, he draws a graph in that text, right? He provides this kind of why we all latch onto, why different egos latch onto a master signifier, an S1, that thing outside. You know, there's like these horizontal lines, the kind of the synchronic and the diachronic, right? How does it, that thing is completely contingent for Freud. There's nothing about it that is necessarily primitive, atavistic, whatever, hoardish in that sense, in that account. However, there's an absolute contingency to the figure to whom which we all agree to love and abide by the rules of, and so on, the S1, right? And the mechanisms through this works, through which this works for Freud is basically that you have this kind of, you know, what Lacan would call this is what Lacan would basically call the unary trait, right? The mechanisms through which identification occurs is repetition, right? We fall into these, we repeat the attempt to be and have the object that we love. And this can somehow, how do you say, kind of, there's a contingency in how this comes to be identified as one external object, right? So she reads Freud in a way that is, you know, she argues that Freud somewhat is as though that Freud is somewhat positing the liberal ego a priori, already there, before the group, you know, before his critique, or what she reads as his critique of the horde. I mean, what Freud is saying is, you know, the problem is, you know, modernity and also progress, the liberal discourse, you know, you can't get rid of the return of the repressed. It's not so easy, right? And psychoanalysis is why, you know, the symptom of why we need that, why we need psychoanalysis to work through this return of the repressed, right? These love attachments that we cannot get rid of, right? That reason and enlightenment and progress have actually promised to kind of get rid of, but haven't been able to, right? So, I mean, it's kind of in a sense, it's counterproductive to read Freud, you know, as a complete liberal, even if he was a self-avowed liberal. Like,
Yeah.
even if Freud, yes, I mean, nobody's going to deny that, you know, he was a self-avowed liberal, but what he offers us in terms of the critique of identity, or kind of the fundamental importance of the critique of the homo psychologicus, the ego, right? Which is the, how do you say, the bread and butter, like kind of the groundwork, the kind of the basic presumption of liberal, you know, of the liberal discourse, right? What Freud gives there is so precious and important for any critique of liberalism that we have to be really careful.
Yeah,
and
that's actually your point, as far as I understand, which is Brown's intervention into the topic of tolerance and so on should not be understood as a fundamental critique or a true critique of liberalism. It's actually more an effort, which, you see, that distinction is actually very significant, because I believe most people that have read her work saw it as something that it maybe wasn't, in a certain sense. The other thing I wanted to so that's very helpful and I think very original on your part. The question I had is, okay, is it fair to summarize here one of the issues as like those who are had by culture and those who can choose their relationship to culture, whereas of course you can see the dichotomy emerge, whereas the enlightened liberal is not possessed by culture, but the others are.
Yeah,
right?
But that's kind of liberal fantasy, right? If you
don't have say more, please.
That's just kind of pure fantasy. I mean, it's a fantasy to think that the symbolic isn't a forced choice. I mean, this is Lacan's whole, you know, you don't choose the symbolic, right? You're chosen by the symbolic. You know, you have a name, right? You have a, you know, I mean, liberalism has this kind of, you know, fantasy of like, you know, you choose your culture. You're this kind of the culture, you know, this is something you somehow, you know, it's like a, you know, I can choose this and that and this and that. There's a forced choice in culture, right? There's castrating function to symbolic identification that you, you know, you must accept. Otherwise, we would all be in, how do you say, kind of mass generalized psychosis, right? Which we can discuss whether liberalism has become that or not, right? But I mean, it's so you don't choose. I mean, even if liberalism wishes to claim that you choose your culture and that there are others who don't choose it, the point would be to show how the symbolic is a forced choice. That's why, I mean, I think in the rest of the discussion, I try to disentangle the way she places Freud as a kind of you know, in the kind of context of, you know, she makes these kind of fleeting remarks about Descartes and the Cartesian cogito and Kant and so on and so forth. And I think it's very important there to resituate the subject of the unconscious in relationship to, you know, the cogito, right? In relationship to I think, therefore I am, right? I am where I don't think. It's kind of like this kind of, you know, important kind of, there's this important distance between the two. So this idea that, you know, it's not enough, you know, and this is something we know, it's a basic thing we know in psychoanalysis. It's not enough, you can't just kind of interpret the fantasy, right? We can't just say, you know, if you have the fantasy of you choosing your culture, you know, then it's premised on you disavowing whatever your own, you know, you have to be able to say that it's premised on you disavowing your own forcedness and projecting it on another. Okay, but that's a different kind of argument, right, from the one that Brown makes about culture. Because she shores up at a point in this discussion, it's almost like she shores up the importance of politicizing culture, or kind of locating, I mean, which is kind of, you know, I suppose like this is kind of exactly what I don't want to do in the book, right? Which is to locate the subject of politics within the sphere of culture. Why not theology? Why not a religion? Why not, you know, of course you can fold into this so many other figures who make similar arguments and who are, you know, crucial in the kind of past couple of decades for so much of the university discourse, right? So the idea is that there's a difference between saying that and saying, well, this is a process of disavowal. Huh? You think you choose your culture and others don't. like you think you have no despotism at the heart of democracy, what Alain Gros-Richard, that brilliant book, The Sultan's Court, shows, which I also kind of use and engage with in the book, is, you know, yes, you can dream you have no despotism at the heart of Europe. It's all Oriental, it's all outside, but that's the fantasy of democratization, right? And the question would be for us, how do you traverse this fantasy? Not how do you, in a certain sense, unwittingly, perhaps, unwillingly, right, reaffirm its resistances by saying, no, let people have culture and let them say it's political, and that's fine. Because then you're back to, okay, then we just have to tolerate that. We have to tolerate the difference. But then we're back in the loop of how much do we tolerate? Where are the limits of our tolerance? Which obviously, I know, I mean, Brown is quite aware of this, right? That's why I think there's a kind of, how do you say, kind of a, yeah, I mean, it's just simply, you know, it's not where she wants to go anyways. And fair enough, but I mean, it's worth pointing out these, right, that there are very serious distinctions and problems at stake.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things that's challenged me in a true sense in reading Lacan over the years is actually his critique of worldview, of the Weltanschauung, in which you offer a definition from Freud. Freud defines a Weltanschauung as an intellectual construction that gives a unified solution to all problems of our existence on the basis of an overriding hypothesis. It is a construction that therefore leaves no questions open and gives everything that we are interested in its particular place. And of course, Lacan is opposed to psychoanalysis being conceived of in any sense as a Weltanschauung. And one could say that you could read Freud imminently as also kind of being aware of the dangers of this. But then you read like the letters of Freud with his inner circle, and they're very clear that they're wanting to create psychoanalysis as a worldview, right? So you see, it's that point of kind of retroactive critique and reading in a certain way, and reading with what Lacan gives us. So I wanted to invite you maybe to talk about the significance of Lacan's critique of the Weltanschauung. I'm obviously one aside that really, Seminar 17, you may remember, this is one of Lacan's critiques of Marxism, right? That's just like the Lukácsian version of Marxism, where proletariat coheres consciousness vis-a-vis a worldview is problematic, according to Lacan. And that's what I'm challenged by as a Marxist, is that argument, because for me, and it's probably my own nostalgia, wish, that something like proletarian consciousness could cohere in such a fashion, you see? So in that sense, psychoanalysis gives us a kind of, don't know, bad news, maybe? Or maybe it's not bad news. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, that's kind of, that's very interesting, because it's so many components to that question. I mean, I think, this would hinge on, of course, what Lacan adds to Freud, and Lacan would lend himself more to the dissolution of psychoanalysis rather than its kind of consolidation, right? I mean, the failure to have an institution, the blunders of even, providing, whatever Miller has somehow undone, that Lacan had successfully undone, and Miller has somehow, that whole kind of the inheritance of Lacan, the way it has become, right? The psychoanalytic associations, and, I think, Tupinamba's work on that, we were in discussion with him the other time, is very important. And I think, that there's, in a certain sense, a quick answer to this, or kind of this would hinge on, do we think that, psychoanalysis reduces everything to one problem, right? Sex or whatever, let's say. Or is psychoanalysis opening up a question that is structured by a certain kind of impossibility to answer, right? A question that you seek you work around, you work through, you labor very hard to kind of figure out, right, what is the question to begin with that you're. So I mean, and I think this is, I mean, what Lacan adds here is this kind of the account of the non-relation, right? The account of, you know, this kind of inherent impossibility that that the instability, right, at the very core of the social link of any kind of relation between self and other, of subjectivity and otherness, this core problem of the non-relation. And I think, you know, this, the question about Marx is really, I mean, in a certain sense, Lacan was right, but not to say, I mean, Lukács is crucial and important and so on, but we can also say, what can Lacan, in a certain sense, add to the Marxian account, right? The proletarian position, the position of negativity, of the kind of, how do you say, this kind of substanceless subject, right? That is, I mean, the entire processes of real abstraction are premised on the emptying out of all content of this subjectivity, right? Is a place of a non-relation. I mean, this is, I mean, or a placeholder for a non-relation. So I think that the you know, I mean, this has now been, you know, the longest, I mean, it's basically, what does psychoanalysis offer to our accounts of ideology? And I think second question would be, is there a theory of discourse, or is there an account of the social link that has a non-ideological potentiality or something, right? That kind of psychoanalysis can offer, right? And you know, these are really big problems, because I mean, on the one hand, it is very important to note that, you know, I mean, again, not to sound like, I mean, Zizek has been, you know, has already since 1990 was talking about this, the necessity of a new account of ideology that psychoanalysis can give us, right? But now in our contemporary moment, I think things are a bit more complicated. So there's so much to, you know, I think like the ideology, the theory of ideology from 1990 of, you know, they know very well, yet they do it, right? So there's this kind of, you know, almost like there's a consciousness already there in our unconscious practices, right? This is kind of like somewhat the proposition there, which is different from a Lukácsian account of a kind of a coming to consciousness to overcome reification, right? And I don't know, I mean, if in our contemporary moment, if we also need to add something to that, you know?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that there's been a logic of the Althusserians in response to the Lukácsian school on ideology, which says you can't have both. Yeah. You can't think both orientations. And I am interested in a revisitation of the legacy of Lukács' thought, actually, and of course Althusser, because I think Zizek is just taking Althusser's theory of ideology and, you know, giving it some upgrades. So I see him as primarily Althusserian there, but you know, like, yeah, all the French Althusserians said, like, Lukács is vulgar, he must be abandoned, he's too Soviet. But you know, yeah, like a lot of dust has settled, a lot of things have happened since that dispute. So I agree with you that we need to rethink these things. And yes, and the Weltanschauung piece has huge ramifications for this question of tolerance, cross-cultural relations, intersubjectivity, etc., because almost if you accept that proposal, you've already upped the ante. Like there's no way that UNESCO or the United Nations could integrate such a truth as this one. In my view, there's something fundamentally subversive. The liberal institutions just could not tolerate that. You know what I mean? Like, yes. Do you agree with that? And how do you navigate institutions that see themselves as trying to promote harmony across cultures and religions and things of this nature? That's one thing that's always been very subversive about Lacan in those spaces. I mean, one of the things that Zizek actually did in the United States, as an aside, one of the areas where he had the most influence was on left-wing, young, millennial age evangelical Christians. I don't know if you knew that, actually.
No. Yeah.
Now I'm telling you a little bit my own
I
path.
wouldn't be so surprised because I mean, yeah, he does. Yeah, he does have.
Yeah, but you see my point though. It's like, yeah, it's revolutionary, right? Like, so you know, you are teaching at the American University of Beirut, which I assume the board members there are very much adopting this kind of quasi-culturalist, you know, Weltanschauung-based kind of mode of that's the air of institutional life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is a sort of spontaneous question, but like, what's your experience there, like as a Lacanian in those spaces, whether that be university or the NGO space, and like, how do you kind of, I don't know, offer this critique maybe?
I think the kind of what is more intriguing, more so than, you know, the niche spaces of NGOs and, you know, big liberal arts institutions, which cater to a privileged few at the end of the day, is, you know, I am in a country that is sectarian by nature. Like this is, I mean, Lebanon, I always say, is kind of, how do you say, it is the future past of the world. Like this is really, in a certain sense, the place where, you know, the symptomatic problems of identification are the bread and butter of everyday life, right? I mean, this is a place of civil war, of neighborly animosity, of, you know, the story that Bustani tells in his own account, right? And that I kind of, you know, that he presents in the book, and I discuss in the book. But so, I mean, if you weren't, you know, you know, how do you say, if you weren't a Lacanian here, you would be crazy. Because you wouldn't be able to make sense in a certain way, yeah? of the context you're in, right? Of the mechanisms of, you know, how do you say, kind of separation, sectarian, you know, the identification, the, you know, but also to not take so serious. I mean, to be able to have a symptomatic account of the symbolic, right? Because you have also the liberal argument is, you know, we have to all be tolerant, we have to all live together. This whole, you know, Lebanon is the message, you know, the Pope constantly tweet. I don't think he tweets, but he kind of, you know, he gives these, you know, the Lebanon is this kind of message to the global community about its, you know, the coexistence. You know, this is the place where this is actually, you know, everydayness, right? And, you know, it's very hard to maintain a sense of sanity, to be able to understand what is unfolding in this place, right? I don't know if you have any kind of context about politically what's been going on here for the past couple of years, but we've had a massive financial collapse, massive explosion. Everything is like on this huge scale, right? Like Lebanon is just like, it's unbelievable. The moment you think it can get worse, it just does, right? Like there's been this, you know, it's a how do you say it? It's a roller coaster to hell. Like basically this is what people have been on here. Like there's devaluation of currency in rates that are unprecedented in the history of capital, hyperinflation in the most obscene, irrational ways, right? I mean, all these things. And, you know, people are so busy, I mean, you know, talking about the necessity of coexistence and like sectarian, you know, Muslim Christian dialogues and interreligious interfaith. Yeah, okay. I mean, sure. I mean, you know, people, I mean, you know, I mean, this is, I mean, you know, I don't think any Christian or any Muslim here thinks that the other is like, turns into a bat at night and hangs upside down in their closet, right? Everybody's pretty, I mean, it's kind of a, you know, nobody really believes that the other is different. That's the problem. I mean, the problem is in sectarian, segregated spaces, which, I mean, there's a lot to be said about American probably society and Lebanese society as well. I think there's a lot of similarities, right? Is that these contexts are based on the disavowal of real difference.
Right.
Because actually there's so much sameness. And I mean, like Freud, I mean, I love that. I think the example that Freud gives is like, you know, it's like the narcissism of minor differences, like put all these hedgehogs together in a very tight space and they're just like porcupines and they'll just like, you know, their needles will just kind of, you know, explode and they'll just kill each other from love, like from deep, you know, from intimate kind of coexistence.
But you know, I mean, but that's very true. That's very true, Nadia. You remember Lacan's point in Television too, about this beautiful point of there's a kind of relation between the acceleration of the discourse of the capitalist and new forms of segregation.
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
So, and even he makes, somebody poses a question to Lacan, and you can see this on the YouTube video of the television remarks. You may remember they pose a question about racism, and Lacan is standing up doing all of his, charismatic gestures. And for this question, I remember him sitting down and being very serious. Actually, this is going to be a real problem, even he says, in our future, right?
Yeah.
You may remember this point. So
Yeah.
like Lacanians are very serious about racism, but they're very serious about these issues, right? But maybe we speak a language as it pertains to these other points here on the subject of politics, of the unconscious, of the worldview, that is really very hard for people to operationalize.
Yes.
Does that sound correct to you, or do you see the same? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, I mean, of course it makes sense. That's why, a lot of effort, I mean, the thing is also, of course, a lot of effort needs to be put into elucidation, but also a lot of, I'm not like an Adornian, but there's also a lot of moments where one knows where you must be resigned a bit, right? Like where you, where you have to just kind of go away and just watch it unfold a bit and then try to think it through, to work it through, right? I have a practice, right? So I have a clinic, and I see in moments of crisis where, how, maintaining that space on its own within a context, let's say like the one I'm in, right, is there's an impossibility to it. How do you maintain the desire of analysis, the desire of the analyst, against, of course, the ideological desire of psychoanalysis? I give that to Gabriel Tupinamba, right? Absolutely. I mean, there's a problem, right? But how does one maintain the discourse of the analyst? How does one maintain that space, the extimate space, both clinically, theoretically, even within the university discourse or outside, wherever it is possible, right? I mean, in a certain sense, what is necessary to maintain that kind of desire to analyze, to listen to the unconscious, to, continue to be, how do you say, occupied by the problem of the question of the subject of politics, because there's so much noise. There's so much noise.
Yeah, no, you're right, and it kind of draws me to this massive topic, which we can only touch on, of Islam and psychoanalysis. We've been talking about kind of Arab culture, kind of writ large, and these literary figures. But could we move to a discussion here of Islam? And there's been several of Lacan's followers, including Mustafa Safun, who's written this book very provocatively entitled "Why the Arabs Are Not Free." Right?
Yeah, I begin with that in the book.
You begin with that. So I want to invite you to comment on his work. Of course, he was a clinician. He was a direct student of Lacan. He produced some original essays in the Lacanian field, which are still studied. Then you have Fethi Ben Slama, who's kind of more Mullerian. He's more contemporary. He is writing in this age of the war on terror. He's very concerned about Islamism. He himself is very secular, and he wrote a book called Islam and the Problem of Psychoanalysis, or maybe it's more like the problem of Islam
and the challenge of
the challenge. Thank you. So those are the two major figures. Then, of course, the Columbia University professor Joseph Massad, who many people see as the kind of heir in some ways of Edward Said, has written a book on liberalism, psychoanalysis, for which he's very critical of psychoanalysis.
Yes.
So I've given you a lot to comment on there, Nadia. But what strikes your attention in this debate? And you can analyze that, maybe beginning with Massad first, if you wish.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I guess the whole book is, if you accept Massad's argument, then my whole book would be, how do you say, kind of, an unnecessary, yet another self-orientalizing gesture, right, in a certain sense. And I completely, Yeah, I mean, fair enough. I mean, Safwan perhaps has liberal inclinations. Fathi Ben Slema is secular, maybe on the left in his kind of formation in the Arab world. Is there's an internal, this is the thing. I mean, it's very different to write about the problem of Islam when you're in the West. Than when you actually live in societies where that is now the only form of politics acceptable, that has kind of risen in the wake of the failures of there was a century of leftist mobilization and leftist thinking and leftist communist politics in the Arab world and the Middle East at large, right? I mean, the Iranian Revolution was a huge moment of, how do you say, kind of shifting kind of the compass in another direction, right? And I discussed this funny anecdote. I mean, in another book, a volume I have on Lacan contra Foucault, right, where I say that it's very interesting that Foucault goes to Iran, after the revolution, and Lacan comes to Beirut around the same time. They have these two trips, which is very interesting that this is what happens, right? Lacan is not interested in what's going on, let's say, in that context, but he comes to a place like here, right, and he meets this kind of megalomaniac Lebanese poet who is a kind of an uber nationalist. I think one of his students was his son or something. Anyways, but this is a side note. But I mean, so that there is a real, first, I mean, just as a footnote here, there is a real internal historical and theoretical problematique, contestation. There's blood that's been spilled. I have other works. I mean, there's something coming out soon on Lebanese Marxist philosopher called Mehdi Amil's critique of Edward Said, actually, at the moment of writing of Said's book Orientalism, which was lauded and came out in the West, while you had people within the so-called national liberation context who were fighting for a Marxian communistic universalistic politics within the context, right, within the so-called Orient, who found Said's gesture to be almost like pulling the rug from under their feet. Now you want to take out universality. Now you want to give us your Foucauldian model of, relativistic knowledges, and you want to do all this. And we're fighting not only an anti-colonial war, but we're fighting within our societies against what we see as reactionary kind of fascistic trends, a return to authenticity and culture and tradition in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, right? I mean, and people like, let's say, this philosopher who I've been writing on recently, they get killed by the Islamic movements. I mean, by the very same movements that have now become, they get physically liquidated and assassinated. And so there's a real, there's blood here about these questions. It's not so simple to claim that, there's the only viable politics, counter-liberalism, is somehow Islamic politics, right? Or to not make this distinction. First, what is Islam? Big word. What does that mean? Is there really a way to kind of, how do you say, make that separation between the rise of Islam and modernity and its, and within the very field, the purview of liberalism itself? Like how do you make these? How do you dissociate? I mean, so many. There's huge questions. I mean, of course, there are so many arguments that have been done, right? Critiques of secularism and so on and so forth. My problem with, let's say, Mas'ad's argument is, okay, we want to dismiss psychoanalysis tout court because, it's pundits who engage with the Islamic tradition or the Arab Islamic world may themselves be either liberals or liberal leftists, right? Okay, from what position are we vouching that critique? What is the alternative that we're offering besides the argument about culture, authenticity, tradition, whatever, something about the forms of being in the world, life forms, whatever that conceptual vocabulary is that one wishes to employ. From what position am I critiquing liberalism, right? I mean, this is a very important, for me, the only position to critique liberalism from would be, a Marxian position, which I think psychoanalysis is a crucial ally to that kind of critique, rather than, one to be dismissed. And I'm not, there's also a history within the Arab world itself. I mean, interestingly, again, you don't engage, in these critiques Why not engage with the, between the 50s and the 70s in Iraq, in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Damascus, in Beirut? There's a massive Freudo-Marxist moment. Huge books on Freud. I mean, even people in the Ba'ath regime in Syria were interested in, like, not to kind of, again, make this, but they were interested in the, what is psychoanalytic thought, or under them, not in the Ba'ath regime, but under that kind of regime of dictatorial rule. There were books published and works done on, there was a serious moment of interest in psychoanalysis. Why not engage with that corpus? And then, these are people who are not translated, who were invested in psychoanalysis, maybe not Lacanians, but like in the project of psychoanalysis and its importance for revolution and for social change. Arab secularists who were Marxian in the Arab world were also interested in psychoanalysis. Why only pick on, let's say, because it's easy targets, right? Safwan and Islam, fair enough, but that doesn't account for a very contentious field, a very kind of an open, ongoing, in a certain sense, site of contestation, right? So, and yeah, so that would be kind of my, kind of a quick answer, I suppose. There's a lot to say about this, right?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's really, really great. It sounds like a project of trying to sort of reanimate certain lost periods of history in new ways, which really resonates a lot with the question of socialist politics in the United States, given that what interests me so much is how radical elements of socialist politics in America were prior to the First World War.
Yeah.
The revolutions of 1848, most of those proletarians, they had exodus in the United States, and there's a incredible communist movement that started in the United States in the inner cities. And so how do you revitalize these histories is a certain interesting question as well. Sounds very much like kind of what you're doing, but yeah, I think you pointed out that, like, it's possible to think politics like beyond Islamism, and I don't know, like Islamism. Yeah, I don't know, like that's a topic of another podcast, but let us stay with this theme on liberalism for a moment, and kind of return to Bustani for a moment, because in this beautiful analysis of Robinson Crusoe, Bustani gives the Oedipal basis of the liberal subject, I would say. Not only Oedipus, but a certain relationship to belonging, a certain relationship to paternal authority, a certain relationship to the family. There's all of these. So my first question is, when you look at the Arab world today, do you still see the Bustani residue? Like I was drawing the comparison between Bustani and Emerson, because I think that Emerson gives the cosmic and the liberal theory of subjectivity that we still, even in neoliberal era, still very much the structure is Emersonian, yeah, and it explains a lot, right? If you've ever read Christopher Newfield's The Emerson Effect, and it's interesting that Emerson and Bustani are kind of contemporaries in the same time period. So is Bustani still alive in liberalism today? And so that's my one question. And then the other question would be, can you explain the Crusoe myth, the Robinsonade myth, because it's so fascinating.
Yes, is Bustani, I think absolutely, insofar as we it's kind of a, how do you say, his discourse, or kind of the way he presents, his account of society and social relations, and, the importance of labor and the division of labor, and, how do you say, the kind of the importance of turning waste into profit, right? He also, he also on other, he also writes, he even has compendiums for like students in commerce. There wasn't business majors in the 1870s, but how to actually do ledgers and do calculate. in Arabic, right? So I mean, so it's kind of, but I mean, he, in a certain sense, he's still, I mean, the account he gives of the social link is, what is intriguing about it is it's unapologetically, resorts to this kind of theological narrative, but I would say, a psychotheological one, because it relies on a certain, how would you say, kind of an account of whatever passions, habits, these, what are the excesses that need to be curbed? Not so much kind of a Schmittian theological, right? Because that would be like what you would think about when you say political theology, right? You would think of Carl Schmitt, or you would think of that kind of account of. So, but I mean, and Bustani, I think he provides this kind of the blueprint, right? It's almost kind of how to be a liberal intuitively, if there was such, like, what does it mean, like by intuition, right? How does that work, right? And he lays that out, and I think it's still absolutely relevant and present in discourses today. I mean, also in a lot of kind of works on the Middle East that that adopt the framework in a certain sense that he provides, right?
Yeah.
Framework of tolerance and coexistence, and all what that means, without interrogating, how do you say, the kind of political economic logic that is actually at work in the real abstraction of theology, or kind of the duty to God, or so what I was interested in with the Robinson myth, or the story of Robinson Crusoe, is that there's this link between theology and economy, or there's a link between psychotheology and the political economic question, because Robinson Crusoe, what does he do? He betrays the name of the father. He refuses his inheritance, right? He rebels, he does his Oedipal rebellion. It fails. God throws him on this island. And what is the first thing he does, right? He converts into Christianity again. He finds the Bible, first thing that's floating around in the water. He finds a box of coins of money. And the first thing he does is he begins to work, to labor, to produce, to take on a private property. What I say, he begins to exist in anticipation of civil society that is to come, right? The one that is the only answer to the origin of civilization, which is nothing but a society organized around private property and the exchange of commodities. Because, Crusoe's problems on the island is he's producing more than he can, what is he going to do with it, right? He has to exchange it. Like this kind of Smithian fantasy of how capitalism develops, right? Adam Smith would have surely loved this novel, right? In a certain sense. So, I mean, it's so, I mean, the link between the political economic, if we understand also the political economic as being, I like this term that Santner uses, this kind of a place of like symbolic investitures, right? Like that there's actually, there's a symbolic there's no political economy without the symbolic sphere, right? It's this kind of, it's not economic reductionism. So that's what we mean when we talk about political economy. We're talking about some kind of economic capital. We're talking about the real abstractions of capitalist relations, which have, whose forms are cultural, symbolic, all these things, right? And in that sense, the political economic aspect is what tethers or what ties together these, accounts about whatever, God, mercy, debt, labor, industry, right? Crusoe's, kind of construction of a colonial settlement out of his, repentance for rebelling against the name of the father, right? Yeah. The ideal liberal subject. In the moment where you have modernity, the destruction of the Weltanschauung, the breakdown of authority, the demise of the big other, the loss of guarantees that comes with the modern scientific revolution, whatever, the Copernican, the whole, what the kind of the rupture that is the discourse of modernity. The moment that happens, right, we reach out for, we grasp onto the Robinsonade ego, right? This is the only way forward. We have to reinstate the guarantees, the big other, the subject supposed to know. I build an economy before it's even there. I enter relations of exchange, produce commodities before capital even comes. I just anticipate its arrival. I do all these things. I labor. My unconscious labor. I mean, you know, there's kind of, so I mean, it's amazing fantasy. I mean,
it is. It's amazing. It's amazing also that the Oedipal drama is not fully overcome. And you say that the basis of the subjectivity for the male is a feminized relationship to the father, and therefore a certain feminized submission, therefore to the ruler as well. Yeah. So there's a kind of strained or failed Oedipal mode, which is intrinsic to liberal societies. I would go so far as to say, right? So there's something
failure and castration. I mean.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, the failure both in the castration of the subject and as well in the recognition of the castration of the other, of the castration of, or in a certain sense, the alienation of the other. How do you go from there is an other to there is no other of the other? There is no other, right? So the double alienation, right, which is at work in the social link is what is disavowed.
Yeah. And yes. And what you're really articulating here, and then you have the whole theory of guilt as the predominant affect of that subjectivity, and that the way that knowledge is produced within that space is neurotic.
Yes.
I.e., it's, and I love that point that you make, which is neurotics are interested in questions which cannot be answered. They're interested in the impossible, with questions which are dead ends. What does the other demand of me? Even the question, of course, that all of the different religions share in, I guess maybe with the exception of Islam, of original sin. And then the fact that Bustani is trying to write a treatise to mitigate sectarian violence and create a quasi-stability to fend off possible sectarianism. In some sense, the liberal would say, what's the problem here? Isn't that what we want? But I think that you could have a counter response, which is to say, well, nobody really knows how to challenge authority at the end of the day in such a structure. That's my main takeaway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The political authority must remain. So I was wondering, do you read it similar to this? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and then of course, like this is a thing that reminds me. So it's like, you know, these French philosophers love to kill the father. Like they not hate, but they have a theory. It's very Nietzschean in a sense that you have to kind of overcome the father in order for kind of liberation and things of this nature. Whereas in this liberal Oedipal thing, the question of the killing of the father, and I don't mean here literal killing, I mean a symbolic killing, doesn't work. It's defective. So what do you, this is very like close to my own interest, I guess. Do you see a relationship here between a theory of political citizenry, subjective servitude, and a kind of, I don't know, maybe inability to adequately take on authority? That's one thing I'm getting from your reading here. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, it's interesting you say that, because that post, you know, after writing the book, that was the kind of, you know, that is kind of something I've been interested in working on. I've been teaching on authority and you know, just somehow in the back of my, you know, and I, you know, I'm interested in the relationship with anxiety and authority. And, you know, how can anxiety make way for, how can we work through anxiety, sit with anxiety, somehow come to a symptom, you know, but this is, I mean, Lacan's psychoanalysis hasn't been able to invent a single symptom. This is its biggest failure, right? Like in a certain sense, we have no new symptoms. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. There's a point you made about original sin and guilt and penance and so on and so forth, which you noted is something that is not shared within the kind of Arab Islamic context.
I just mean by like my understanding of Islamic theology is that like this notion of fitra, kind of circumvents the Christian centrality of original sin in their theory of the human. Of course, they still have a theory of sin. I don't mean to suggest otherwise.
No, but there's a different relationship to guilt.
It's an important distinction, maybe. Yeah.
No, sure. Yeah, I mean, I would have to think about what are the repercussions of that. I think that's what kind of, I mean, this would feed into Slama's argument in a certain way, right? Because the argument is Islam almost has to create its own transgression. It has to create its own moment of
and of course, he has that whole thing you may remember of the foreclosure of name of the father.
Yes.
Muhammad was an orphan. The 99 names of God are absent the name of the father, and all of these things. And even the beautiful subversive point, which is that the first followers or converts to Islam were those abandoned by the father. So there's something, and then the whole Hajr thing, which I think is very controversial that he goes in that direction. But all I'm trying to say, Nadia, is I really love that way you concluded the book and left us lingering with these problems of authority, these problems of the kind of the true challenge of liberal. How do you kind of create a I don't know, alternative to this mode of subjection that we live with? It doesn't really feel like it's just the kind of Arab. I mean, it is very unique to the Arab thing and what we're talking about, but all of these structures are
a universal question. That's the whole point, right? I mean, it's a universal problem. I mean, I think the failures of liberalism, whether liberalism, are we living its long end or not? This is another question, right? Are we already after liberalism? That's also something to consider, right? Because, I mean, what we witness today, the new forms of authority, populism, figures like Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, the list goes on. We have 19 of those at once in the Lebanese society, right? This is not, all the sectarian leaders are these exact figures, right? There's nothing new about these kind of symptomatic arrivals of figures that wield authority and give guarantees. And, I mean, this is a phenomena that we're witnessing on a global scale. I think, my question in the book was almost kind of saying that I'm opening, this is, I mean, already people who work on this stuff outside the Arab Islamic world understand that this is a huge problem, a huge question in modernity. The crisis in authority, what is, how do you say, the afterlives of authority after it has died with modernity, right? In a certain sense, the argument of the book is that this is, this universal problem is evident in the Arabic, in the modern Arabic, kind of whatever world, right? And its formative, some of its formative thinkers, somehow one has to work through that, right? You have to work through the problems in the particular to be able to somehow come to the universal, right? To be able to, move from conditions of, false freedom and kind of abstraction, whereby, as I say I think in the last chapter, real abstraction works by particularizing an element of the particular, right? The worker's body, his kind of skill, whatever, right? And plus also the culture, the Arabs, whatever, his mustache, his whatever kind of stereotypical orientalizing, right? This is real abstraction. And how do you, there's no way back, right? There's no way, you can't just say, I hate, we can just rail against abstraction. Abstraction's bad. And then we would end up with a culturalist argument of let's just kind of reaffirm the particular. There's no way back. And I think what's intriguing about the thinkers I look at is that they also know that, right? These modernizers of languages, there's just no way back to anything. I mean, there's no back. We're on this train and, now what do you do? How do you get off it? How do you stop it? How do you take it where you want to go, right? I mean, so in a sense, I think, that's why the questions that, the insistence that, this brings us back to the question of the subject, or the subject of politics, if it is the subject of the unconscious, if I could say I've discerned signs of that in this kind of whatever kind of Arabic context, or the material that I look at, how do you kind of construct the universality of that problem? I mean, clearly I have those kinds of political commitments.
Yeah.
Which I try to work through in the book, and maybe I don't fully succeed. That's why I'm working on another one. But I mean, I'm so this is I don't know if that's kind of the kind of answer.
No, it's this has been a great conversation, Nadia. I wanted to see if there's any that maybe I missed. I know we've covered a good amount of ground. You already intimated some of the new projects you're working on: Authority, this work on Arab Marxism, which sounds really great and very much needed. So maybe any final words about what you're up to, or anything that you feel is kind of significant that I may have neglected as it pertains to discussing this wonderful book. And we're of course going to link to it for folks to purchase. Hopefully the price is reasonable.
Okay. I can't afford it. But with the hyperinflation in Beirut right now, the book cost me the equivalent of $1,000.
Oh.
No, really. I mean, this is what it would cost in the current moment I'm in. No, I'm sorry. I think they promised that it will be out in cheaper version, and I think there's an ebook out already, if I'm not mistaken, or in the process of being kind of so no, I mean, thanks. No, this was really great. I wouldn't want to add anything. Thanks for this thorough, kind of really close reading of the book. As I said, It came out COVID and everything around it got canceled. So this is very, it's great to be able to talk about it. I'm a bit rusty on its content. It feels like it's from another lifetime, but I hope this was, I hope this will be okay for you. And
it was fabulous. No, I think our listenership is going to be very stoked to hear what you have to say and all of the wonderful insights that you had. So Nadia Bou Ali, thank you for coming on, and we'll see you soon.